We talk with Maryellen every week, and I feel like she's always like, okay, well, let's start it. Like let's look at some of those foundations. And sure enough, when we approach them with being like, okay, we could give you 30 supplements and 2 medications and all these lifestyle changes. And it's just like, no one wants to do that. Doesn't feel good. But it's like, if we can maybe address, like Kaitlyn was saying, like, let's just do 2 pillars. Let's get you at some basics and get you feeling better there. And then once we've addressed those, then we can work out to some of these a bit more ephemeral, symptoms and things happening. But the great thing too is a lot of our stuff overlaps. So
Yeah. Welcome to the Advanced Women's Health Podcast, where we empower women with the latest insights and advice on holistic health. From cutting-edge medical research to practical wellness tips, our mission is to help you thrive at every stage of life. Join us as we explore topics ranging from hormonal balance and reproductive health to nutrition and mental well-being. Whether you're seeking solutions for a specific health concern or simply want to enhance your overall wellness, you're in the right place. Let's embark on this journey to better health together. This is the Advanced Women's Health Podcast.
Hello, everybody. And so my name is Dr. Maryellen Tedeschi. I am one of the naturopathic doctors here at Advanced Women's Health, and I work at our Ancaster location in Ontario. I am joined today by Kaitlyn, another one of our docs in Ancaster, and Ashley, who's in BC. So we thought it would be fun to give you guys that inside look to see how we talk about cases, what we educate our patients about, and how we really work together to make sure that we are giving the patients the best assessment and plan possible to help reach their health goals. So thank you guys for joining me today. We have a couple of great cases we're going to chat about to let you know what we treated this week and what we saw in office this week. Really talking about the Perichaos, those changes that happen in perimenopause and how it can get really messy and a lot of different symptoms can come up. And sometimes our patients can come to us feeling super overwhelmed, not knowing where to start, feeling so foreign in their bodies, trying to understand where these changes are coming from. So where do we want to dive in talking about some of these Perichaos challenges and where we have patients go from there?
I'll start that just because I think that is a really interesting window of time. So I know that a lot of patients that come to see me, like a lot of them, I see a lot of women like 35 plus. And I feel like a lot of the information that we're getting right now is like any change in your body is hormones, like any change in your body, it's perimenopause. And so a lot of people are asking me about that when they come see me. And so they'll come with different symptoms like night sweats, or I think a big one that I find presents earlier on is like brain fog or forgetfulness, or just like little things like, oh, what's the word for that? I can't quite remember. I used to be able to do, 3 things at once, and now I need to really focus just on one thing. And so, I had someone come in kind of say this who's, in that earlier stage. And so the way that I approach that is to definitely say, hormones could be starting to fluctuate, but a lot of things that are also fluctuating at that time is looking at the basics, which we talk about all the time. But it's like, I will take those patients through some questions and testing about blood sugar and insulin, inflammation, gut health being a big one. And then another one that I really focus on for a lot of that energy or brain fatigue, that memory loss, is mitochondrial support and oxidative stress. So that we have a lot of mitochondria, which are these energy powerhouses in the brain. And when there is an issue there, we can find that fatigue happening. And then also I find blood sugar and insulin just plays such a huge role, as our brain actually does start to switch to needing more fat as fuel than glucose at that time of life. So having that metabolic flexibility and that insulin sensitivity becomes even more important at the same time that it's actually starting to become less sensitive. So that's definitely where I like to start. And I find it's just a lot of conversation, because that's not really sexy to talk about. on TikTok or whatever. So it's not as snappy as perimenopause. So I find it's a lot of conversation about these like underlying background things that also start to just get a little wobbly and a little out of balance around that window, kind of before hormones really start to like going up and down, which we see happen kind of before it starts.
Absolutely. And I think that's so important to notice because even if I reflect on the week that I had in practice, it's, when we think about perimenopause and menopause care, of course, a lot of listeners might be thinking, oh yeah, HRT hormones, what are we doing to help support the hormones? But the reality is more often than not, we are actually really working on building those foundations back up because like you said, Ashley, we think of perimenopause or what Sarah has coined as perichaos, which is that time just even before, that happens. It's actually the tipping point of a lot of changes in our immune system, inflammation, histamines, insulin glucose regulation, gut microbiome. It's a lot of that really drives a lot of the change before we even really see the hormones take place. So I find, especially this week in practice, a lot of the conversations I've been having with patients, they're coming in feeling like, their hormones are out of whack. I'm sure we hear that all the time, right? My hormones are out of whack, which we validate those symptoms. Absolutely. This is a very challenging time for you to experience a lot of these symptoms, especially if you're still cycling, you're in perimenopause, all of a sudden your periods become heavier. You're having more breast tenderness, more PMS, more cramps, more mood changes, right? And what we have to appreciate too is the other factors outside of that are driving the symptoms other than, the roller coaster of estrogen that Ashley drew out for us, right? It's a lot of the inflammation, histamine changes, and we're often drawing those connections for patients and it can be a real aha moment. And I think it's so rewarding when I'm able to kind of map that out and say, hey, you're noticing a lot of these other symptoms like more nausea, more sensitivity to foods or wine that didn't, cause an issue before. You're getting more headaches. How do we draw these connections and really show you that one of the foundations that we need to work on is immune system health, focus on stabilizing those histamines, and then give you that support. So, through this next phase of transition, through perimenopause and beyond, we really have a good even ground on all of those foundations to make sure that your hormones are able to work in their best way possible. And then we think about the HRT as the cherry on top. So we think about utilizing those hormones and introducing them into a plan along with those foundations that we're still supporting. So I find that those conversations happen more often than not. And it's very validating to the patient to let them know that, yes, these symptoms are happening. It's not in your head. We have some reasoning behind why they're happening. We talk about the stuff that can seem boring, like gut, sleep, stress, etc. But building those up can be just as impactful as getting that awesome prescription of hormone therapy if you're the best candidate for it. And, it is a really good option for your case. It's, the blend of both can be quite amazing for patients, right?
That's so well put. And Maryellen, I think that you coined the term that HRT is the cherry on top. I always use that term with my patients, and I know that I got that from you just to help like drive home with them that there are so many other pillars, like you both have outlined, that we need to shift and that ultimately are just as important, if not more important, than only looking at the hormones for overall health and longevity. But one other thing that I really wanted to echo that both of you touched on is I think one of the most important parts of working with this population of women over 35, let's say, but it's in recognizing that there could be a hormonal component. And by hormonal, I mean like the estrogen, progesterone, those kind of reproductive hormones that we think of in perimenopause, that acknowledging that it could be a factor and it might be one of those pillars, but also not blaming all of their symptoms on those changes. So I think that I've seen a lot of women who have come to me and that's kind of the answer they're given is, oh, well, you are in perimenopause and your periods are changing. So of course your sleep is going to suck and your nervous system, you'll be anxious and you'll have hot flashes and night sweats. And so go off and live with it. But there are so many ways that we can optimize all of those pillars, which I'm excited to get into. But I think both of you outlined a lot of the things that we're going to talk about really well.
Yeah. Kaitlyn, I know you had a really cool case, something that you treated this week that you wanted to share. So why don't we dive into that? Because I think it really targets a lot of these key foundations that we were talking about.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring up this case specifically because I do this with a lot of my patients, but I just really liked how well-rounded her case has been so far. And so this is a 62-year-old female. She started seeing me a couple of months ago, and her main concern is sleep. So we're always chasing the patient's goals. And in this case, she has like a Fitbit or some kind of tracker, and she gets like 20 minutes of deep sleep a night. For reference, if you're getting 8 hours of sleep, we should be in probably deep sleep for an hour and a half to 2 hours. So she's feeling unrested. She's having the brain fog, having the low energy that comes with that. But it was eye-opening for me to break down. And I laugh because I draw it out for my patients just because it helps my own brain to put it all on paper and put those pillars down, but it helps them as well to be like, here are all the things in your case specifically based on what we've talked about and what we've investigated with labs that could be contributing to why sleep is so poor right now. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's all these things wrong with you, but it's just like, if we pull 2 or 3 levers at once and we decide which ones are the most relevant, then we start to see the rest of them shift. So in this case, this patient was an interesting one for me because I like to say I have trust issues with the thyroid panel, and this is why. So this patient has known that she has hypothyroidism, which is underfunctioning thyroid metabolism, since 2000, so 25 years now. She's been on levothyroxine, which is Synthroid, and it's a medication that is used to treat hypothyroidism. So her dose of the medication has not changed for years, but her symptoms have, and her sleep has gotten worse in the last 5 years or so. So in talking to her and in getting some of the labs that have been run in the past, we could see that her thyroid antibodies have never been tested. And that's an interesting one for me because even when the rest of the panel, so our TSH, our T3, our T4 hormones, those might be tested. And even if those are quote unquote within the normal range, I have seen a lot of times the antibodies being flagged high. And this is where I say I have my trust issues with the thyroid panel because I end up running the thyroid antibodies more often than not. So in this patient's case, her thyroid antibodies were both flagged, the anti-TPO and anti-TG thyroid antibodies, which we know alone, those antibodies can contribute to changes in sleep, as well as changes in other ways like weight management, which was another one of her main concerns. So we as naturopaths, I think this is where we shine, and we have a lot more tools to address the thyroid antibodies while not changing her medication with her MD. And we're just providing that additional support to help that thyroid metabolism. So that was definitely one of the pillars that we talked about and that we investigated with labs, and it came back with something worth moving. This patient, she has a few pillars, so I will go through all of them. But the second one is one that Ashley alluded to, running that 2-hour insulin glucose challenge and looking for how insulin and glucose are dancing together. So this is a change that we see a lot shifting in that perimenopausal window. So we're seeing a lot more leaning towards insulin resistance. And in my patient's case, she was struggling with cravings, had, skin tags, weight that wasn't moving, some classic kind of signs of insulin resistance. But we did that 2-hour insulin glucose challenge and found that she was needing a lot more insulin to manage her blood sugar than is optimal, right? So that is what kind of qualifies as insulin resistance. But in her case, and this is why I love an IGC, is because it's not really a cut or dry yes or no, you have this or you don't. It really tells us about this individual's metabolism. So in her case, she needed a lot of insulin to control her blood sugar, but her blood sugar was actually coming back really low. So it was under even what we would expect it to be. So again, going back to her main concern being sleep, we're thinking that she might be getting low blood sugar episodes or hypoglycemia throughout the night. And that is one of the main contributors I often see to that frequent weight gain throughout the night, is looking at how we're eating, what we're eating, how close we're eating to bed, addressing the insulin dysfunction there, that again is pretty common in that perimenopause population, and then supporting her towards that better, deeper sleep. I think it's hard to talk about sleep without a component of nervous system. So that was actually one of the first things that we worked on together before we had run any labs and found the thyroid antibodies and found that insulin resistance. Nervous system and sleep, I mean, they're best friends. It's hard to talk about one without the other. So in terms of this patient, I mean, she's a teacher. So I saw her in August. We were just heading back to school soon. Everybody has their stressors in their life. And as well, I mean, there's stressors internally like inflammation, blood sugar, dysregulation, immune system dysfunction, all of that also quantify as stressors internally. So working on the nervous system was actually one thing off the bat that was helpful for her sleep and did move the needle even before we got to addressing the underlying things that we found in labs. And when I say nervous system, I'm looking at kind of two main factors of it. So if somebody is living in the sympathetic nervous system, let's say, and that's like your fight or flight state rather than your parasympathetic, which is your rest and digest, which is where we want to be when we're trying to fall asleep. So if somebody is living in the more fight or flight, or they're having stressful days over and over again, their body is probably releasing a lot of that adrenaline, norepinephrine, epinephrine hormones. And that matters a lot when we're trying to fall asleep, because our body from a physiological state might not feel safe enough to fall asleep. So even if you feel like, all the doors are locked and you're technically safe, your physiology may not feel safe enough to fall asleep and stay asleep. So sometimes we're using things like nervines, things like GABAs, things that will help calm that nervous system and shift it out of fight or flight. And also using some lifestyle stuff. Like, I think this is where sleep hygiene comes in helpful to try to calm that nervous system as much as we can. And then the other hormone that I think about with nervous system, which I think we all do, is cortisol. So one hormone that is often tied with stress. And this one, if it is pumping high daily and we are in that chronic stressful state, this is one that I'll often see contributes to like frequent waking and being really alert when you're awake. So that 2 to 4 a.m., I'm awake and I feel like I could get up for the rest of the day. I'm so alert. Cortisol can be a contributor to that. So I'm looking into people's stress levels and stress response, because ultimately we want that cortisol to come down for the day and that melatonin to go up as we are getting ready for bed, right? I have so many pillars. Today's episode is brought to you by none other than Advanced Women's Health. If you are interested in diving in deeper to your health, if you are finally ready to feel like yourself, and you are finally over hearing everything's normal, everything's fine, and you want a deeper dive into your healthcare, then we are here to help you. We are currently helping patients in British Columbia and Ontario, Canada. But don't worry, if you're in another province, still reach out, get added to the wait list as we expand coast to coast. We cannot wait to work with you. Check out the show notes for more information on how to get started.
But I think what I love about a case like this and having, like showcasing how we think through a symptom like sleep and knowing this patient's history that, they're postmenopausal now, but they've been diagnosed with hypothyroidism for some time. I think what I hear, as some key things as you're sharing the case and how you explain this to the patient is that symptom sleep, how that is, when we break it down into those foundations and how those different buckets are really contributing to the symptom, that is really what changes from patient to patient. So in this patient's case, there's that inflammation immune response that we know is happening. We have data from the insulin glucose challenge to show us that there's changes in that insulin and glucose connection, likely contributing to some hypoglycemic events. We know that nervous system is playing a role. And we know that, so if we think about it, we've been adding on that layer of the fact that this patient is in menopause now. We often talk about perimenopause and menopause as being that tipping point for a lot of people, for a lot of women going through this, because the needs of the body changes quite drastically in some cases. And we see that, what typically worked, you had a certain threshold of what you could handle for stress, a certain threshold of what, you could handle from, a dietary perspective and eating habits. Now, all of a sudden, those aren't working in the same way. So it's just really validating for those patients to understand those connections when we're able to draw it out like that. So I think that's really awesome.
Yeah, 100%. And in her case, like, there will likely be a reproductive hormone component, right? Like, going back to that conversation of perimenopause and menopause, like, this patient specifically was kind of put into menopause earlier than she would have been after having a hysterectomy. So then it gets a little bit trickier to figure out which stage hormonally she's in, since after a hysterectomy, like, the hormones can change, but especially if someone has kept their ovaries, there can still be some of that estrogen, progesterone still cyclically. So our job really is tracking those symptoms and looking with the patient at their symptoms. And then it's so important, I find, the timelines with patients, because say, the hysterectomy happened 15 years ago, but sleep has just changed in the last 5 years. And where did hot flashes come in? Were they 10 years ago? And when did they stop? Was that 5 years ago? And really getting the chance and the time to timeline out those symptoms, which can feel, like Ashley said, very up and down and very chaotic, let's say. But we have the luxury of kind of mapping that out and giving the patient more information on where they might be at, especially post hysterectomy, where it's a little bit less straightforward than you stopped your period for a year. And so we're through that menopausal window. But 100% things like those hormones play into sleep as well. And I'm excited to keep working with this patient, because I'm sure that cherry on top will might get introduced eventually as well. But it's been really interesting and enlightening to see all of the other pillars that are worth moving in her case, and to know that all of those pillars as well do in some way tie back to perimenopause and menopause and those hormones.
Kaitlyn, that made me like, I had kind of two thoughts from what you were saying. Like, one, I think the thyroid specifically is interesting in the postmenopausal time, because our amounts actually change in terms of like what we would say how an optimal TSH is, like that actually does change as we shift in that time of life. So, even just checking on that, being like, are you over medicated right now? Like, are we trying to get your TSH down to like a 30-year-old's healthy TSH? Or should we maybe like, come back on that a little bit? So I think that just having another set of eyes and someone that can do a little bit of a deeper dive in terms of thyroid is so beneficial. And then the other thing I think that comes up a ton on our calls is like, okay, I have a patient who wants like weight loss. They also have some autoimmune conditions. They are also inflamed, and there's some like a lot of period pain. And we're like, okay, like let's always bring it back to those foundations. So I think like, we talk with Maryellen every week, and I feel like she's always like, okay, well, let's start it. Like let's look at some of those foundations. And sure enough, when we approach them with being like, okay, we could give you 30 supplements and 2 medications and all these lifestyle changes. And it's just like, no one wants to do that. Doesn't feel good. But it's like, if we can maybe address, like Kaitlyn was saying, like, let's just do 2 pillars. Let's get you at some basics and get you feeling better there. And then once we've addressed those, then we can work out to some of these a bit more ephemeral, symptoms and things happening. But the great thing too is a lot of our stuff overlaps. So
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
and resveratrol and these things where it's like, here, just take those. We've got histamine, we've got gut bugs, we've got blood sugar, like we can really do a lot with some of these like foundational ones. So I liked you talking about that, because I think that in complex cases, it can feel really daunting and it feels really overwhelming for the patient too. Like, it's just like, I have everything wrong with me and no one knows where to start, because, not to throw shade on conventional medicine, but it's just like they're addressing all of these 30 different symptoms with 30 different medications. And it's just like, it's really exhausting and overwhelming. So it's like a top down approach, sort of, where it's like, let's just look at that bottom line. So yeah, I think that's a really good way to approach this time of life, which can feel
Absolutely.
really chaotic and a lot of symptoms.
And one other thought that I wanted to mention, because, you bring up the interesting point about the antibodies, the Synthroid. So, and I know that this was brought up on another call too about, similar situation where a patient's been on Synthroid, not feeling great. And then we realized that, there were antibodies, and just how the naturopathic approach to help address that, along with the medication, the Synthroid, to make sure that we have the best plan forward. I think we can apply that to so many medications. And so, and we love having our BC docs on our calls, because you guys have a great prescribing scope. So what you're able to use in your toolbox helps us to understand too, if a patient is coming to us and they're on something like Ozempic or Mounjaro, and, they've reached a threshold where they're just not getting those benefits anymore. It's like, we can still leverage the benefits of that medication, that prescription. But then that's where the magic, if you will, of what our work does, is we're able to then bring it back to those foundations and understand, where have we reached kind of our, threshold with that medication, and what else can we do to help support that. And we see that with HRT as well. So if patients have been super excited to get on that HRT prescription because they're struggling in menopause, and then, HRT helps with some symptoms, but they're still not feeling great, it's also so validating to explain to that patient, like, yes, this prescription is so valuable and it's helping in this way, but here's the other areas that we also have to focus on. So yes, bringing it back to, all of those different areas and pillars of health, and how we can, lend a helping hand in order to make sure that patients are getting their goals met.
Super important point about the medication that both of you brought up. Like, I know, Maryellen, you talk about this in terms of HRT sometimes as well, especially in perimenopause, is that sometimes you're not on the same dose of something forever. And that shouldn't be the expectation, because symptoms will change and will evolve into eventually later into perimenopause and into menopause, and the hormones are changing. So we can't always be on the same dose. And so I think about that in terms of all medications too, is that maybe the same dose that you have been on for 20 years isn't the correct dose for you or the most optimal anymore. And then we kind of have to investigate why. But I also like, actually, what you said with I always go back to something that Sarah always says, is the more complicated the case seems, the simpler you should start in terms of treatment. And I feel like that just allows us all to mind map it out and be like, okay, what am I really looking at? What are the pillars that exist? And then I know when I draw out even my pillars and mind map for patients, when it gets really complicated for them is when I start drawing arrows from one pillar to the other ones, because like, they're not even separate things, right?
Yeah.
They're all connected to each other. So we're going to pick the top 3 to move today with our treatments. And then that's where
the triangles, right? Like, Sarah tells us, bring it back to those 3 areas and those loops of dysfunction, right? But it's so true.
Yeah, they're all connected. So it's super interesting. Well, we think.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for sharing. I hope this was really insightful to all of those listening or watching to learn about how we talk about cases, not only clinically to each other as colleagues, but the information that we share with patients when they are sitting in front of us, in our office and coming to us with symptoms and health goals and lab results and, how we break it down and what we present to the patient and how we leverage each other's knowledge in order to make sure that we're supporting them in the best way. So I hope you all found this insightful and interesting and maybe took something away that you can add to your own health. And we look forward to chatting with you more on our next episode. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you had as much fun as we did. And if you loved today's episode, share it with a friend and leave us a review. That is how we spread this message, and that is how we are going to revolutionize healthcare in Canada for women. Have a beautiful day and be well.